Hey everybody, back for round two, much anticipated. James and I are going to start reading some books together. We encourage you to join us if you're interested. And the first book is Occult America, which actually the title actually freaked out some viewers. And it is written by one Mitch Horowitz, who's very interesting. He's got a background in publishing, and he's what you would call a scholar practitioner. So not only is he a scholar of specifically New Thought, which we'll get into what that is, he's also a practitioner of New Thought. And he's very aware of the relationship between New Thought and AA as it morphed through William James into Bill Wilson into the big book. So ideally we'll talk about that at some point. But before we dive in, James is going to give us a little overview of the book.
Sure, yeah. The book is structured as a series of short histories. It sort of takes the subject of occult in America from the time of settlers up through what he calls the New Age, which he puts at around, I'm going to get this wrong, like 1960 through the 80s through,
Yes.
Yes, right?
Yeah.
And so the New Age is not the focus, but it's kind of the end cap of the text. He starts with the definition, a fairly loose definition of the occult, and then tells a bunch of stories about how that sort of subculture evolved over time in the United States. And it goes through several phases. I had to take notes here. It starts with sort of early settler mysticism, which includes things like Mormonism and Joseph Smith and his kind of experiences with seeing stones and angels and such. It moves from there into mesmerism, which is sort of, it begins in Europe, but sort of gets imported into the United States. It's sort of the origins of like hypnotism, which is also the origins of psychotherapy. But it's the early stage idea that you can affect other people's minds and control things. Then a little bit through theosophy, spiritualism. Spiritualism is like the sort of fad and big craze that happened when people were first believing they could communicate directly with the dead, when that became a popular phenomenon. I guess not when people first thought that, because people have thought that basically forever. But in the United States, when people first were, sitting around and having seances or using Ouija boards and such. Then into New Thought, like Piers said, which is a sort of like power positive thinking movement, this idea that what I think controls my destiny. It dips into hoodoo for a chapter, touches a bit on the origins of the neo-Nazi movement, and then moves into the New Age. So it covers a whole lot of ground and tells a whole lot of different stories along the way. I found the book, like when I was reading it, I found it really captivating. I think it does a really nice job of telling the stories and getting you kind of into these worlds and the experiences of people. It's sort of like spiritual experience after spiritual experience in all these different weird, unlikely ways, right?
Yeah, I thought it was very captivating too.
Yeah.
So maybe a couple just talking points. What was like the things that really grabbed you?
Yeah, there was a couple of pieces that stood out most to me as like they kind of popped and caught my interest, right? And one was a chapter on the Ouija board, which I think kind of freaked you out.
It did, actually.
The Ouija board thing caught me for reasons we can get into in a little bit, but it was sort of this weird overlap with my dissertation research. Meaning that my dissertation research was about recovery writing. I interviewed a bunch of people in recovery about how they wrote. Some number of people said they had experiences that were like, I suddenly started writing and what I wrote, I wasn't even aware of what I said until I read it, or I felt my hand moving across the page, or God inspired me to write something. There's sort of the sense of like the writing was taking place in communication with some other being, the spirit or God or whatever people call it.
So literally like automatic writing kind of.
Literally automatic writing, right? In like the spiritualist sense of like you're asking something to write for you through you, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's very much kind of the territory that's covered in the Ouija board chapter, except that it's like got this extra funky collaborative, you and me are both touching the thing, and then it just reveals whatever it reveals to us, right? So that caught me as a like interesting comment on the kind of stuff I've been researching. And then I like this chapter on, what's the guy's name? There was a story in here that like could have been Frank Robinson, could have been an AA story. It was the mail order prophet chapter.
That was a great.
It's this old drunk, and he catches a spiritual experience somehow, and then he starts selling lessons by mail, and walks around a small town in a fur coat and drives a nice car. Pretty classic. Like that felt like the most 12-steppy moment to me. Is like this guy could have hung with Bill,
Yeah, I could see that whole story being done in a Frank Capra film.
Yeah, right.
Or Jimmy Stewart.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was good stuff. Okay.
How about you? Like, what were the parts that popped for you?
The things that I really liked, and I want to find the name of this person just so I give her credit. So there's a chapter called Go Tell Pharaoh. About it's called The Rise of Magic in Afro-America. And he gets into basically what is variously called root magic or hoodoo magic, not to be confused with voodoo. So it's Hoodoo. And what really, really got me about this was a couple things. One was it was talking about what I think is particularly American, which is this kind of, well, I guess it happens with religions around the world, but this syncretism. So that's these different religious things meeting each other and creating something else, but it's very much like folk magic. Mm-hmm. It's not coming from on high, it's rising up from the people. And he's really pointing to how some things came over to America with slavery, with the Africans, and then over time they would use just very household things for divination, like the bones off of the chicken dinner, a deck of cards, not tarot cards, playing cards. And then in some parts of the country, and I can't find her name, I wanted to find it. I looked up this scholar who studies this, but this woman points out that root magic in different parts of the United States is very different. So what she says is root magic in parts of the South, where there were a lot of Jewish people settled, and the Jews were merchants to the African Americans, you had this sort of Kabbalistic Jewish mysticism meeting the folk magic, and then kind of landing in a way of reading the Old Testament. So even though most of the African Americans were Christian, they were really into the book of Exodus, being led out of slavery by God, and that really interesting. But then she says, if you go to San Francisco and you're down by the ports, the root magic got very much mixed up with Chinatown. Mm-hmm. This was really fascinating. She said all these black exploitation films of the 70s with, Carl Lee and Kung Fu fighting was actually African American culture butting up against Chinese culture, Chinese martial arts, Chinese medicine. And she says if you go around the country, you see these different flavors, these different spices.
Yeah.
I love that. And then the other thing I liked is I was really taken with Edgar Cayce. Mm-hmm. So the fact that he had these super humble origins, he had these sort of psychic gifts from a young age, but he was really, he's kind of an Appalachian figure who knew his Bible, and it evolved from there. And he became famous and somewhat even respectable, but he never really, I don't know if this is, yeah, I'd say this, he never sold out.
Oh, yeah?
He never became what so many of these figures in this book do, which chasing the dollar bill or chasing some kind of political power, or getting all weird politics and stuff.
Right. Which is not to say that he didn't have like a patron who sort of influenced him in some ways.
No, he did. But remember the very end where he gets the letter, and he was so good about answering these letters about the young man who's tortured by his sexual orientation.
Yeah.
And given Casey's Christianity and, demographics, the guy, he couldn't have been more kind and progressive, really wonderful.
Right.
So there were high points and low points. Both prior to us recording, James and I both said that when we came back to the book to prepare for the conversation, it was a very different experience than reading the book to begin with.
Right.
And I'd like to hear more about how it was different for you.
Oh, well, I guess it's more like level of excitement or freshness or whatever, mostly. When we were reading through it, the stories are so vivid that it felt really exciting, and I had all these new ideas about, what to say about it. And then when that sort of cooled, going back to it was like, I don't know, I've moved on and I'm reading other things that go into some of the stuff in more depth. And so this sort of feels like the surface of a subject that's very deep. And it also feels like, I don't know. So I don't know how you are with reading in your spiritual life, but I tend, or at least historically, I've tended to look for books that felt like they have something practical for me right now. If I pick it up on the toilet in the morning and I read it, my brain is going to be set in a certain way for the day, right? And there's certain books that'll do that, and other books that are like curious and interesting, but they don't have that they don't ground me or whatever. So this is a book that's fun and interesting and curious, but it doesn't have that kind of practical 11th step in the morning kind of feel to it for me, right?
Yeah, no, it definitely doesn't. Right. What it did for me was, the reason why it was kind of, so when I came back to it, the book disturbed me more coming back to it. Uh-huh. And the reason why it disturbed me was kind of what it wasn't saying. Mm-hmm. And having, I'm always doing research, so, and there's all, this, there's all kinds of weird serendipitous, synchronous phenomena doing research. Yep. And so one of the things that I did was, I've been doing, is I'm getting very much into a kind of deep dive into who Frank Buchman was and what moral rearmament was really up to. Mm-hmm. So the audience doesn't know this. The steps largely evolve out of this thing called the Oxford Group, which itself will later morph into something called moral rearmament. And the part of this book that's talking about these strange characters, was it William Pelly or something?
Yeah. William Dudley Pelly, I think is his name.
William Dudley Pelly. And so this book doesn't, to its credit, this book doesn't hesitate to talk about some of the strange far-right affiliations with the occult. Right. Mysticism, religion generally. And when you study Buchman, he's moving in these same circles as this Pelly guy, right? Mm-hmm. And some of the criticisms of the Oxford Group are like this. This is really interesting. This is all new stuff. One is that people would leave very quickly saying, there's no Christ in it. No Christ in it. And Buckman seemed to be mostly fixated on what he called soul surgery, which we would call kind of like the fifth step.
Yep.
But he had a particular focus on sexual content. So he's got, he wanted to get players and shakers and movers, prominent people, moneyed people, professional people, and he's got them in a group giving up the goods on their sex lives. There was a woman who left very quickly after she saw that, and she called it a Christian nudist camp.
Right.
And then the other thing, which I think we both saw in the book about the big book, was how when they did Silent Time, which was the other big thing that Buckman was into, you could receive messages or inspiration, whatever you want to call Holy Spirit, from about somebody else in the circle.
Right.
And this is what really turned off Bill Wilson, thank God.
Right.
Because Bill Wilson, these guys kept saying to Bill, hey, Bill, man, we're getting this message that you're supposed to go down and proselytize to the guys on Wall Street, which would be consistent with Buckman wanting to have the moneyed power brokers. And Bill's going, I'm not getting that at all. Like, I'm supposed to go help these drunk guys. So I started reading this, and then I started reading this stuff about this Pelly guy, and then I'm thinking in terms of today and how so much sort of a lot of the conspiratainment world and New Age world actually is very right. Mm-hmm. And I'm seeing this sort of thing evolve, right? That bothered me.
Right.
And then the sheer whack.
Just for when you say very right, you mean very sort of right wing.
Right wing, that's right. So very, Buckman, for instance, was very anti-union, very anti-labor. Mm-hmm. And he was soundly criticized for having this, supposed Christianity that really had no interest in broken people,
right,
downtrodden people.
Right.
Now, people, the defenders of Buckman will say, yeah, but there's this time when he met Gandhi and all that. But I think his detractors would say the reason why he wanted to meet Gandhi was he knew that would be on the cover of the newspaper. Mm-hmm. It wasn't some sort of interfaith religious pluralism thing. Yeah. So there was stuff like that. And then some of it's just so damn zany.
That in the okay, sure. Like Ouija board stuff is weird, and hearing the ghosts come to you of the dead, that's weird, right?
And the fact that it's just spread across this country before it jumps over the pond, there's something about here mm-hmm. that like really grooves on that.
We were ready for weird over here.
We were ready for the weird.
Yeah.
I mean, so were you surprised with the Ouija board that there were precursors to the Ouija board?
I had kind of known that a little bit.
Oh, I didn't know that.
I'd bothered to, like in the past, have looked up like spirit boards or whatever, and there's like an online museum and you can see all the different weird configurations of it from like, they're different from like the Milton Bradley standard or whatever.
Right.
So I knew that existed. I didn't think of it as like, I guess I hadn't associated it, I should have, with like, because in my mind growing up, it was such like you could buy it in Toys R Us, right? And the book kind of talks about this. It goes through the whole cultural history of Ouija boards, like, from spiritualist technology to toy for your kids that you buy in Toys R Us, right? And that was more my association with it. So thinking like, oh, this grew out of the desire to popularize, and this really goes to the thesis of the book, right? The spiritual or the occult in America is very much about democratizing the secret knowledge, right? So a special few mediums are able to contact the spirits. Well, that's not good enough. We want everybody to be able to do it. So here's this Ouija board that you can just do with your friends at home, right? And anybody's capable of it. You can sit around and ask for something to move the cup around, right? That's a very interesting artifact. Ouija board is an interesting artifact, both of this sensibility towards spiritual realities and the desire to make those realities, for better or worse, like a thing of public consumption and discussion, rather than a secret for initiates. Right?
Yeah.
Right.
And yet, the story that you like the most, I wouldn't call it a secret for initiates. I mean, the element of democratization is there. I'm going to let you tell the story, but it's still kind of highbrow. I mean, that's what's so striking about that story to me is this isn't the stuff of sitting around the fire and telling some weird ass Ouija board story, which can be really good.
Right.
This is about a noted poet.
Oh yeah. Oh, I picked that up. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, James Merrill. There it is.
There you go.
I didn't realize when I bought it that it was that big. It's like 600 pages of Ouija board poems. So this guy and his lover, I believe, although they're not fully explicit about that, get a little house in Connecticut and a Ouija board and start communing with the dead.
And he's already a noted poet when this happened.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And this is sort of a collection of 3 books of poems and a play, which were all written with Ouija board stuff. And each of the sections won different literary prizes and stuff and were well noted in their time. So in the book, he calls it like the literary classic of the Ouija board, or of the spiritual movement, right? And you can see it because it's very much like deep reflective poetry, but then every once in a while, can I show you this? I don't think I can. Every once in a while, there's like lines or stanzas of the poem that are in like full caps. And that means this is literally this is dictation from the Ouija board. And he sort of gives indications elsewhere in the poem of like who's talking and when and where they're from. And
so there are multiple Ouija board personages in this
poem? Yeah, it's really weird. So first they're like in contract with this guy Ephraim, who is like he's like a Greek Jew from like the 1st century in this weird town that he names, and they later look up and confirm that town existed. They didn't know before. There's little confirmations like that of the top, right? But then they also contact like the spirits of their dead parents who pass away while they're writing the book, and dead friends who pass away while they're writing the book. And then like other poets, Wallace Stevens shows up, and the editor of Pope, I don't remember his first name, is like some sort of spiritual advisor to James Merrill in ways that they didn't know. And then in the second book, they start getting contacted by like vampire bat brains that are there to like fuck with human DNA to evolve some kind of substance that they can consume and become more tangible. It gets really weird.
What era was that written?
The second one, where it gets to vampire bat brains, were in the 70s. The earlier stuff was like 50s.
Wow. How was the vampire bat brain stuff received well as poetry?
It won, yeah. What prizes did it win? Maybe I can find that. It won some kind of National Book Critics Circle Award or something. I don't remember. But yeah, it was. And there's like, Harold Bloom reviewed it well and all that. It got like the biggest trumpets were blasting for this one. But it's really like in the second book, especially, the first one is more like very much grounded in the human experience of contacting this weird thing and being uncertain of it, but being fascinated by it. And it's sort of grounded in that, like, I don't know, the earthiness of being a human being in contact with this weirdness, right?
Yeah.
Now, the second one is almost entirely like we're using the Ouija board today, and then all this block text of like what the bat people are saying about the universe.
I mean, to somebody who, a few of the people that reacted to the title of this book,
Yeah.
They would be validated by that, because
Yeah.
you mess with that shit and it's going to get you.
Right.
And so that feels like, the way they would argue it. Yeah, notice at first it was benign, and then it became, you went from mom to the bat vampire things. It's like, whoa.
Real quick. Yeah, right. And you won literary success for doing it. So there's even that like weirdly temptation of it at all, or whatever. Yeah, like I think people are not wrong to be. I'm not going to pick up a Ouija board. I'm interested in it, and I'm interested in what it has to say about like the way writing works. But I wouldn't recommend it as an 11-step practice.
No, although there's certain precedent for it as an 11-step thing.
Yeah.
Arguably. I mean, Bill wasn't afraid of all this stuff.
No, was there some story about him using it to contact? Now I haven't hunted this down, but somewhere in the cobwebs back here, there's the story about him using the Ouija board to contact some saint, something or other.
Saint Boniface.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, Saint Boniface, who was a real saint, and Bill suggested, I don't know how strongly he suggested, that Boniface was the patron saint of the 12-step movement.
Right.
And he did, I believe, mention this to Dowling or Francis Ford, one or the other. These guys are Jesuits, and they were like really kind of compromised by the whole thing, because they were like in the Boniface, but they were like, shouldn't be messing with that shit.
Right.
So yeah, well, I think that's a good place to go in a way, because I don't know about you, but I kept noticing the different streams, right? So you got Swedenborg, who's like, even though he's a European figure, he's very much influenced America.
Same with Blavatsky.
Blavatsky too, but I think less so, because with Swedenborg, he mentions Johnny Appleseed. So Johnny Appleseed would, historical figure, quintessential American, he would tear up Swedenborg books and put parts of them on the crossroads in the frontier of Ohio and Indiana. William James, his father, Henry James Sr., was deeply into Swedenborg. And then there was a great Swedenborgian landscape architect. Maybe he was an architect. Right now, I can't remember. Burnham. His name was Burnham. And that is, I believe, Lois Wilson's grandfather.
Okay.
So Lois grows up in a Swedenborgian church. This is kind of interesting. Swedenborgianism had a very kind of class thing. It was sort of professional. Swedenborg himself once was on the cover of Time, or on a list in Time magazine, of one of the 10 smartest people who ever lived. He was an amazing engineer.
Mm-hmm.
And so there was the Swedenborgian thing was kind of an upper crust professional thing. So you got that filtering down, into AA, through Lois, through William James, into Bill. And then you got the New Thought stuff, which I'd like to talk about more. And then you have what is Horowitz'S thesis, which is this sort of practical, democratized spirituality that, I don't think the 12 steps could have been born anywhere but here.
Right.
And, most rank and file AA members don't know that, Lois was in the Swedenborgian, and Bill had a spook room, and Bill and Bob was in on it to a degree too, and all that, So to me, it's like, our movement is very much cut out of the same cloth that Horowitz is writing about.
Right.
Um,
Yeah, it's at that weird intersection of like the Oxford group before it really becomes moral rearmament.
yeah,
Before it's like preaching to nations instead of preaching to men or whatever it was.
yeah,
So they're at that beginning, and then within this cultural context of all this spiritual weirdness that we're calling occults.
right. So if you go back, you see, the antecedents. You see, like he talks about in here how a bunch of stuff through Masonry and interest in Hermeticism jumps the ponds with some of the founding fathers and leading intellectuals. I think it's important to remember that stuff is very Protestant. It's hard for people to get their head around that, I think. That Rosicrucianism was essentially a Protestant thing, and Masonry is considered the devil in some Catholic quarters. And so these ideas are all kind of moving around. It seems like there's a disinhibition here from studying those things that might be over in Europe. I don't know that. Then there's the encounter with the Native Americans, both mostly violent, but also some synthesis. Mm-hmm. So you've got all this folk culture from the immigrants meeting Native American wisdom with this overlay of Masonry and Hermetic stuff. And then in the 19th century, we get Emerson. And so here's this guy who's like Unitarian, really, although he kind of turns his back on it. And he starts reading Eastern Vedic literature. And then that combines with the individualism of America and the practicality, but it's still like going as far out as you can possibly want to go. It's got a flavor. This whole thing's got a flavor.
Right. And I think you're right in pointing that like the soup is a richer blend of ingredients than even Horowitz captures here. Right.
Oh, definitely.
So we get like this, and I think the part of that, so that's one of my criticisms of the book, is that like it tells all these really cool stories. The stories that it tells are mostly those of men and mostly those of white men. Not entirely, because it has that great chapter on hoodoo, like you pointed out. But it felt like there's a lot, depending on how loosely or broadly you define the term occult, like there's a lot more things you could include, right? If occult just sort of means like contact with the spiritual world in a way that you want to share with other people, if that's what it means in the American context, then all of that stuff seems like it's ripe for inclusion, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's missing, but
it's like, I mean, he's definitely, and I don't know if it's a fair criticism, but he's writing a book he'd like to read.
Yeah, sure.
And that really brings me to the whole new thought thing.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of one of those weird terms that you get it's hard to nail it down because it's so amorphous. So William James called it mind cure. It will become new thought. Today, it's associated with things like The Secret or the prosperity gospel in Christianity. It spreads in these different currents. And it always comes back. It never seems to die. It has its many, many critics. Horowitz, who to me seems to be intellectually of a much higher caliber than a lot of people that swim in these waters, I've heard him say that, it has shortcomings that are, it does not deal much with feeling, with the affective life, and it doesn't deal well with human suffering, and it doesn't deal well with the body.
Right.
So it's this spirituality that's in the Christian circles today, they say, name it and claim it.
Yeah, and it's yours, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and so, think positively, have a single-mindedness, kind of work with the mantra. The guy that Horowitz really likes, this Neville Goddard guy, says the imagination is God. So your imagination is God in you. Reality, in some sense, is plastic relative to your thinking and your intention. And I mean, this stuff is like, it is strong. I mean, COVID and the crash of 2008 and, the shrinking middle class and all that stuff, it makes it even stronger, it seems to me. And I find it, frankly, profoundly disturbing.
New Thought as a whole.
As a whole.
Right.
Yeah. I know, maybe I'll never get Horowitz for an interview now. But like, take Bill, for instance. I don't want to bash Bill. A lot of people think I bash Bill all the time. But, Bill, to his credit, he wanted to help alcoholics, and he was very democratic about that. But his own sort of politics were very much to the right. They're very anti-FDR. They weren't particularly, they were not in favor of labor and things like that. And his favorite minister, although Bill never really claimed Christianity, was Norman Vincent Peale. Norman Vincent Peale, who's in here, is the New Thought minister. He's a Presbyterian minister, huge church, really famous. And Peale himself was very anti-union, very anti-FDR, anti-New Deal. What people today don't realize is this period of time, from the Depression until the fall of the Iron Curtain, there was so much anti-communism, and there was so much quick association between being liberal in the sense of pro-labor and all that is having red tendencies. I mean, young people don't really realize this anymore. And who else was really like Norman Vincent Peale, loved him, in fact? Donald Trump. So Peale is this interesting figure that appeals to Bill Wilson and Donald Trump for largely the same reasons. Unfettered capital, positive thinking, single-minded willpower. It doesn't matter if you're wrong. Don't say you're wrong. That's more Trump. Just do it. That's not the gospel that I follow.
No, no, it's missing. So, actually, do you mind if I read a little piece out of this?
Yeah, I'd love it.
Okay. So this is from my guy. I'm forgetting his name again. Frank. Frank Robinson, right?
Okay.
He's very much a New Thought guy. He's very much a joke.
Mail order guy. Mail order mystic or prophet.
Mail order mystic, and his mail order stuff is all New Thought stuff. And I think I want to read a bit of the story, and then the way it lands, I think it's really, to Horowitz'S credit, a bit of a critique of New Thought as well, right? So Robinson grows up. He's born to a hard-drinking minister in England, I believe. His mom dies of pneumonia. Dad sends him and his brother off to America with not really any money, and they're basically orphaned on the streets of America. Eventually find a job, move ahead, and then it says, as time passed, Frank Robinson discovered a crippling habit, binge drinking. And then he gets kicked out of a bunch of different military services in multiple countries. Classic sort of alcoholic story. And then we have this. Then one Sunday morning, everything changed. Frank returned home and sat alone in his room. And then on that day, he pleaded to be shown something more, challenging God to reveal himself. "Oh God," he cried, "if I have to go to hell, I'll go with the consciousness that I went there earnestly trying to find you." Rather than feeling hopeless, however, Robinson found that a strange sense of peace settled over him. He felt powerful yet relaxed, as though lifted to some higher place, which is almost like the Bill Wilson moment of like, there is a God, he hasn't shown himself to me, right? And then has that same kind of thing. Robinson came to realize that through the right exercise of thought, this holy power could be tapped as a limitless resource. He determined to spread his vision of, quote, a workable, usable God, unquote. It was a do-it-yourself thinking turned to the furthest extreme, an audacious, heretical, and profoundly American approach to religion. Also a very AA approach to religion, right? I was totally messed up. I caught this lightning in a bottle, and I don't know what it means or what the reality of it is, but using that lightning is what we're about, right? It seems like very on point for that. And then in one of the few passages where we actually get some sense of what these people do, like I'm always reading these stories being like, if I wanted to do what they're doing, how would I do it? You don't get a lot of that in this book, other than buy a Ouija board and see what happens. But right here, you get a little piece of his mail order prophet stuff. And it says, he encouraged the repeated use of this key mantra. And it sort of gives two mantras in a row. First one is, I believe in the power of the living God. And the second one is, I am more and more successful. Which the difference between those two is like maybe the whole critique of New Thought, right? When I think of myself and imagine myself in the spirit of, I believe in the power of the living God, that's a kind of grounded, connected, and even ethical space, right? Because if I believe in that, then I'm more responsible for it on this earth, right? Mm-hmm. I am more and more successful has no religious content, only has this sort of American rags to riches story, kind of pull yourself up by your bootstraps ethic to it. Well, really, it's just sort of like, if I believe it, I'll magically get more and more wealthy, and that will be the confirmation of the spirit in my life, right?
Name it and claim it.
Right, it's exactly that. And then Horowitz comments in the next paragraph, like New Thought as a whole, Psychiania, which is the name that he invents for his thing, had difficulty providing ethical depth, which I think is exactly what we're talking about now, right? This idea that, cool, you can have a new car and a fur coat because you prayed all day, but so what? Like how, if there's no like ethical imperatives that come out of that or moral principles that come out of that, you don't behave better or differently toward other people. You don't improve their lives in any way. You're just sort of getting rich off of praying right. Then what's really the substance of that?
Yeah, that is so troublesome. Right. And so now we do see a lot of tacit, not always explicit, messaging that goes, if you're spiritually fit, it'll be reflected in your bank account or your sexuality or your physical appearance. Mm-hmm. And to me, that's, really, really removed from the cross.
Yeah.
Whatever that means to you.
Sure.
Now, to AA's credit, and this is, I do have a deeper appreciation of Bill for having read a book like this or done that Oxford group research. Bill will stay politically the same creature, but he really does believe that this is about meeting alcoholics in their depths, and that lightning in a bottle, I love that, is there, right? And that the manifest, and I think this is more than implicit in the steps. I think this is explicit, that what you do with that is you help somebody else.
Right.
Although this is getting towards resistance recovery now. I think that the things that you're not allowed to relate to your spirituality, that you're discouraged from doing in AA, kind of reflects some of that political consciousness of Bill and Buckman and all that.
Okay.
But we're not supposed to look at alcoholism as having anything to do with racism and war and economics and the machinations of the government or big pharma or all that.
Right.
So it's kind of interesting. There's some sort of anti-activist thing in the genetics of AA and New Thought. And actually a lot of this stuff, and the few people that do get political, they get political in a really ugly way.
Right. Right.
And I'm not saying we should all be political. It's just so odd for me to think of spiritualities that don't contend with the huge questions of human suffering and evil.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems like, and I did once upon a time talk to a New Thought person who was very committed to it. And she basically was arguing with me that if everybody took this approach, then that would be the New Jerusalem. That there would literally be a universal prosperity. And that's just like.
Right. We don't have the material resources on this planet to pull that off. Like.
Not so long as 6 people have 6%.
Right. No, we're all going to be like those 6 people.
Yeah, that seemed to be what she was saying. Or they were somehow tapped in, and we just,
Right.
Yeah. So that's what scares me about a lot of this. The On Heroin book, that brilliant book by Brian Culkin, he talked about Adderall and speed being the drug of people that really buy into that.
Mm-hmm.
I'm gonna continually self-improve. I'm gonna outwork everybody. I'm gonna stack credentials, and furthermore, I'm gonna sell that rhetoric too, because Tony Robbins just bred millions of Tony Robbinses.
Right.
And then sometimes I'm in AA and I'm like, whoa, I'm beginning to hear kind of a Tony Robbins thing up here.
Yeah, you do hear it sometimes. You hear the stories of like, I got my everything back, right? Yeah. Everything's back and better than ever. And look at the material success I have now that I'm a year sober, 2 years sober, 3 years sober. I got my car, I'm buying my job, pretty lady, blah, 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 whatever it is, right? It's like, right. My body's better than ever. I'm working out. I feel great.
Lost 38. Yeah. So, and that seems to be what they're selling in terms of, if I sponsor you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You'll have the job too, and you'll have all the. You
right.
want what I got, and what I've got is all this material stuff.
Right. I'm more interested in. I'm out of prison. I'm never going to get a very good job. I want to be a decent dad. How do I deal with that? What are the spiritual resources for that?
Right. Right.
But yeah.
So yeah, it's the politics of the book were, or I should say this, the William Dudley thing was really disheartening for me to read. It was really hard.
Maybe we should break Dudley down a little bit for the audience.
Right. So I mentioned earlier that there was sort of the birth of the neo-Nazi movement was covered in this book, and that's him. That's William P. Dudley. He has a kind of a out-of-body, visionary spiritual experience.
It was one of the early popularized near-death experiences, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's right. Right. It's just a sort of spiritual vision quest or whatever, and then he writes about it for some popular magazine, with most of the racism censored out. But then, over time becomes progressively more and more committed to his sort of white supremacist ideas, and then publishes a revised version of his story that contains things he left out, apparently. I don't know if it's like he decided to add some things in, or if he really edited them out before. But the stuff that's in this time are like, I don't even want to quote it, but it's explicitly racist and spiritually racist in the way that's like, human beings have evolved spiritually, and of course, white people are at the top of that evolution. We're the best spiritual people. And so we need this political movement to sort of enforce that reality on the already oppressed in this country.
Right.
So totally gross, and also very scary in its implications. But the thing that got me about that was that if he is to be taken at his word, that content was, he had this out-of-body experience, he met with spiritual mentors that were also disembodied, they were higher creatures or whatever, and they taught him these racist things, and sort of encouraged his political activism in this way, then that means that the content of his spiritual experience was itself racist, right? And that's not something, like, I've had a bunch of disillusioning experiences about what spiritual experience can be over time, right? And how it may or may not affect people's politics over time. Mm-hmm. And that's a sort of like the low point in that arc, was like, somebody can have like the white light experience and then come out of that more racist than before.
Right. It's almost like it deepened and confirmed their convictions.
Right. Right.
Yeah. So what's curious about that is, so this is a spiritual experience that's not, there's no sense of redemptive in it.
I mean, personally, he says that he's better off than ever before.
Right.
But then ideologically, he's like on this other trajectory of like, I'm going to go start this movement to hurt people.
Right. But it's not that near-death experience where, he encountered his own shadow and was like, holy shit, if I get to live, I'm going to try to make things right with some people.
Yeah, right. Almost like the other way around.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's another point here, that we're not seeing much of those kinds of redemptive narratives in the book. I mean, the point that's really, sort of really quite interesting is when you talk about the hoodoo magic and all that.
Yeah.
I once met some scholars from this, they were American scholars, but they studied Asian religion, specifically Buddhism. Mm-hmm. And they said, Americans have these really weird ideas about, Thailand and Sri Lanka, like people meditate in their houses and
right.
do all that. And they say, for a lot of people, Buddhism is like Christianity here. You observe certain holidays and you go to your places of worship sometimes, and maybe have little domestic rituals and that kind of thing. But they said, a lot of the spirituality of these places, the vitality, the place where the energy is just kind of a folk spirituality that's really preoccupied with divination, mm-hmm. Healing, conjuring, and matchmaking. Mm-hmm. And that's the kind of street spirituality of the common person.
Right.
So obviously practical, super practical.
Right.
And so I think that in a way, this democratization theme is in a way just sort of, because we're a post-indigenous people for the most part. So it's a kind of it's a folk spirituality, but it's got this weird relationship to the marketplace.
The New Thought.
Well, New Thought and all of it, really. I mean, it's mostly New Thought, but the guy's a mail order prophet, or, the whole thing about how Ouija boards, the whole chicanery of how that became,
Right.
the toy company gets it. And
Yeah.
yeah, it's always got this kind of,
Even with the spiritualists, the sort of the Fox sisters and their toe knuckle cracking
yeah.
seances, right? Like they sort of invent table rapping or whatever and communicating with the dead, and it becomes this huge thing. It becomes publicized, and like, so
Yeah.
part of the democratization is also like a commercialization or popularization of the thing, right?
Yeah, now I think we're getting somewhere. Yeah. I wouldn't have thought that, but that's probably kind of what's another thing that's eating at me. Yeah. It's like, let's commodify this bad boy. That's something in our DNA that we do.
Right.
We really do.
Right.
And that's probably one of the reasons why Casey was so impressive to me, that, he had financial problems. He did try to improve himself financially, but he never was particularly good at it, and he didn't turn people away.
Right.
I want to say that there's something in our DNA like that too that's good, but it's sort of drowned out by all this other stuff.
When you say our DNA, you mean like people in general? You mean like recovery?
No, I mean, when I say DNA, I mean Americans.
Oh, sure. Right. Something about helping your neighbor. Or
and
something.
not looking for,
Right.
Not just being decent.
Right. Yeah. I think that's in us somewhere. You don't see a lot of it in the news.
No, you don't. You don't see a lot of it in the marketplace. You do still see it in AA and hear about it.
Yeah.
And there's still a lot of people that go to church that lead lives like that and so on, or synagogue or temple or whatever. But
right.
Yeah, to me, it was ultimately a troubling book.
There's one more piece that he doesn't cover, not a lot, that I think might be worth touching on, which is we don't get a whole lot of like debunking stories. Like we get the history of seances, but we don't get the Harry Houdini coming in and sending spies in to find out how it's faked, right?
And there was a lot of that.
There was a lot of that, like throughout all this, right?
Mm-hmm.
I had this out-of-body experience. Well, how do we know? Or I'm talking to spirits right now. You can hear them knocking on the table. Or I'm mail order selling you the dream of being rich and famous. Like, it's constantly flirting with this idea of fraud and like con artistry that he never explicitly states or deals with, right?
Yeah, and it is an interesting narrative. There's a book, I can't remember the title of it, but I read it a few years ago about William James's career. He spent 30 years in parapsychological research, the Society for Psychical Research, I believe. And they were doing a lot of that. And there were the different factions, and people would defect or come back. But there were also the people that could not be found to be fraudulent. So in Hampshire, there was a woman named Lenora Piper. We'll talk about a Yankee name. And she was just ordinary housewife and could do all this stuff. And they would hire detectives to try to figure out how she did it.
Yeah.
And never could.
Right.
So, James was right in the middle of that. And he was, if something was proven to be fraudulent, he was not a true believer in that sense. He was but when it was all said and done, he said, yeah, there's some strange stuff going on.
That's that's an even extra weird piece to this is the hucksterism and the spookiness.
Yeah.
It's sitting side by side and like sometimes intermixed in the same experience, right?
Yeah, I mean, and that's in our DNA too, because that's kind of the Wizard of Oz, isn't it?
Yeah.
Right.
Don't look at the man behind the curtain type stuff.
Don't look at the man behind the curtain, but then when you wake up after the tornado, you're like, that wasn't just a dream.
Right.
You know.
Right. And there are some, and occasionally in places he sort of addresses this incidentally. Like he won't say, this could be fraud, but here's how it's valued. He just sort of mentions, like, I think it's in the Mary Todd Lincoln piece where President Lincoln's wife is, you know, trying to contact Willie after he dies, their son. And then when he dies, she's contacting him. There's sort of a famous picture of her with the ghost of Abraham Lincoln behind her. And her son has her like locked up for,
Right.
Says she's crazy and spending all the family money on this stuff. And she's like, no, I got to talk to my husband and kid. And he sort of makes, Horowitz makes a kind of a comment that's like, for the people who really believed this stuff, it provided some of the most profound experiences of their lives, right? Which I think is an indirect dealing with the sense of fraud. Like, even if you're conning me into believing that I'm talking to my dead son, if I really buy in and believe that, that's transformative for me in a way. That has value outside of whether or not what you're saying is true.
Yeah, and I think this next book we read kind of delves into this quite a bit.
Yeah, that's right.
And that is a phenomenon. So there are, I mean, so right now, for instance, there are these chaos magicians who build a whole system of applied magic, or whatever you want to call it, based on the writings of Lovecraft, based on fiction.
Right.
The whole Cthulhu thing. Well, yeah, and so there's even a TV show now, Lovecraft Country.
Oh yeah, I've been wanting to see that.
Yeah, some people say it's good. And then, you know, you see this, there's a book, there's a fiction, a novel called, of course now I can't remember it. It's a novel written by an African-American author about these soldiers in Italy, these African-American soldiers in World War II. And there's this character in there who his street name is Walking Thunder. And he's got this hustle back in St. Louis or someplace where he's a street preacher and he can make money. And he says, he doesn't believe any totally cynical, bad man, but he says there's sometimes when he's in it and something happens, and he's not sure if it's real or not. And it seems to affect the people around him. And he's such a captivating character because to deal with this, you know, is the spirit trying to get me in my hustle?
Right.
You know, it's amazing. He will go off into the nearest, you know, ghetto, whatever, and just get fucked up to try to make that go away and go back to being the guy with the hustle. So I think there's, you know, and Elmer Gantry, right? So what a great story. I mean, if you haven't seen the movie, watch the movie with Burt Lancaster, but he's that same guy. And he's a shyster, but he gets so far into this thing that the division between real and unreal, it gets blurred.
Right. Right. There's something about, one way to interpret that is there's like something about the imagination and the unconscious that gets evoked even in moments of like theater, right?
Yes, it's in this case, what's so strange about it, it seems to be transcending your intention.
Right. It's operating.
I mean, your intention's there because you're naming these things.
Right.
But you don't have to believe. Yeah, it's like.
Yeah, it's independent of your belief.
Yeah.
You evoked it, and here it comes, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Really wild. Which actually is at the heart of chaos magic.
Right.
You don't have to believe in it to work with it.
Super postmodern approach to the.
Yeah, it's very, but Yeah. Yeah. You wonder if that's baked into something American here.
Chaos magic, I think. I mean, it's
Well, or just this sort of like playing with things in a freewheeling kind of way
yeah.
to see what'll happen, make some money, and something happens. And then now we got a whole story and a whole little cultural stream coming out of it.
Right.
I mean, it's kind of back to our last conversation for me in a way, these maps and territories thing.
Mm-hmm.
At some point, if the map gets enchanted without reference to any kind of truth value,
Right.
its phenomena follows in its wake.
Right.
And you can't really say that the phenomena isn't real. I mean, it seems like we're in this territory where truth versus real.
Yeah. There's a fuzzy gray area between.
Yeah, right.
Right. But the Americanness of it, I feel like, is in the pragmatism that can evolve in that space.
Mm-hmm.
Like, well, I don't know, but what does it do?
What does it do?
Does it work?
That's right.
Do I get to talk to my dead kid? Okay. Do
Right.
I get to make
And who are you to say that isn't my dead kid if what I'm hearing from him is in his voice?
Right.
Cadence or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Then great. Then that's working, whether it's true or not. It's working. Yeah. Right. And that feels like the thing that also matches with AA. And throughout this book, right, is that sort of sense of like, here's all this weird stuff. I don't really know what's real, but we can do something with it.
Right.
And I can touch the planchette and it will start talking to us. The Ouija board will start talking, right?
But to circle back around, it's like, what are we doing with it?
Yeah.
I mean, so with AA, just the overwhelming beauty of it is a bunch of weird guys, completely non-professional, huge social problem. They come up with a solution, and they are piecing together something out of really weird ingredients.
Right.
And they create something new, and it works. But even the background of AA is always the question of, some people want to monetize it, hustle it. I mean, people accuse me of that.
Sure. Well, I mean, that's Bill Wilson from the beginning.
Yeah, right out the gate. Yeah, so I'm left with some interesting questions. And then, I'm reading some other book where, the worse, some character says the worse things get, the better the stuff sells.
How so? Like the more demonic it is or whatever.
I think there's some truth to that. No, meaning the more social tension, cultural crisis, economic.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
So there's a turn to the spirit in times of crisis.
Right.
Yeah.
But also, sometimes on the level of let's get the rent paid.
Oh, sure.
So.
But those go hand in hand. I feel like
They
if there's an uptick in popular need for some other world that's better than this one, or some kind of assurance beyond what I see in the newspaper, then the culture is ripe for the huckster.
And the profit.
And the profit, both. Sometimes in the same form.
Yeah. Yeah. So this gets really interesting because where we're landing archetypally is we're landing with the trickster.
Right.
We're landing with maybe the American version of the trickster.
Mm-hmm.
And the trickster as an archetype is Hermes and the coyote and all that, but he's always been associated with commerce.
Mm-hmm.
And commerce is always is in the archetype has to have an amoral quality, that you cannot thrive in commerce if you're too scrupulous.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, and then furthermore, if you're really into doing business, you can't be too picky about who you do business with. Right. And it's about moving between worlds, commerce, but it's always, the trickster always has this element of just when you think you have it by its tail, it gets you.
Right.
Yeah.
I guess it's not going to be pinned down as real or not real.
Yeah, you're not going to use it. Yeah, it's not going to be pinned down as real or not real.
Right.
That's right. I often, when I'm blathering about being recovered, I'm beginning to develop this sort of weird meta awareness about that. That sounds really strange to most people.
Right.
But in my map, I'm recovered, and there are a bunch of people on the map that are recovered.
Right.
And you're really talking about something. I mean, on the one hand, it seems it is stunning, right? On the other hand, it's kind of ordinary, because I don't think anymore that it's just people that go through steps 1 through 10 get recovered. I mean, I think there's recovered people out there who never went to a meeting.
Yeah, for sure. And there's people who went 1 through 10 and never got recovered.
Yeah, never got recovered. And that seems to be like one of those things that exist in that place, with Bigfoot and the ghost.
Like recovery itself.
Yeah, recovered. Yeah, there's the recovered guy, and there's Bigfoot, and there's
yeah,
and there's a bunch of people that saw it.
It's like a cryptozoological phenomenon.
Yeah.
Right. I feel like we just phased into maybe we're wrapping up, but I don't know.
I think we have. I think if people like this and they want to keep going with us, they should join us for the next book, which is Strange Frequencies, the extraordinary story of the technological quest for the supernatural, by Peter Berbegal.
I'll rubber stamp that.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people are commenting on this, that with the digital culture, there is a lot of digital synchronous phenomena happening.
Okay.
Where you think of somebody and the phone rings, or
right.
The connections that can be made through the internet are enormously enhanced, and they just sometimes pop. So I think it's kind of a logical step from Horowitz. Is that fair? You read it. I've only started.
Yeah, it's an interesting piece that sort of takes, I think it does a couple of things. It takes the kind of cultural trends that are surveyed in this book and focuses on like the material aspects of it. Like, what kinds of stuff did they make, right? If we got magic, like how is it also infused with different technologies that evolved over time? So that's cool, right? How do you reprogram a computer to do the I Ching or whatever, right? Does that work, or what are the resonances there? And then it also more directly than this book sort of talks about that. I guess that tricksterism that we landed on is like, is it real? Is it not? Is this a joke? Does it matter? Like, those questions are a little more in the fore in that book than they are in this one. So
it's actually kind of, what little I've read is spooky.
Yeah.
So when he gets into those mechanical what are they called?
Automatons or automata?
The automaton stuff was frightening and fascinating.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, which are like machines built to look like they're alive, right? And are they maybe?
Yeah. What is it that they're infused with from the human?
Right.
There's some sort of strange, is this evidence of some sort of strange godlike capacity that we really do have?
Right.
Which goes back to Horowitz and the whole reality is somehow plastic to our imagination and will.
Right.
Yeah.
And part of that is it's like taking that into hacker culture, right? Things are plastic to my will, I'll build it, right?
Yeah. All right. Well, excellent.
Yeah.
And away we go. All right. Have a good day.
You too. Thanks everybody for following along.